Recording. I thought that maybe one fun thing to do would be to just bring up something that I've been thinking about. The future of work is something that I think Beth has been talking about for a long time, right? Because on the one hand, there's a fear of automation taking over, but on the other hand, it's the promise that there are ways to change our workforce so that it's more effective, efficient, and maybe even bridge some demographic gaps. And so I've been thinking about it, and I thought, oh, well, it might be fun because there's so many interesting people on campus that I never know. And so I thought that I had this presentation kind of ready because I went to visit some folks at Emory, and I thought, oh, I would share it with you all, and maybe we can spark some interesting conversations. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but of course it's not going to be the right screen, so I'm going to have to stop sharing and then share it again. I think I'll just share all of it. So you won't be offended by my baby pictures. Not mine, but my children's. Here we go. All right. So FYI, I put all the various links on the screen, in the chat, so you guys can follow along. I kind of took out chunks that I thought were interesting, and so we can, you guys are any questions, or if you have any insights, especially Beth, because I know that she, sometimes gets to see behind the screen. So on that topic, Beth, do you know anything that we don't know?
Oh, I'll hold my. No, let's proceed. I think the main thing is add everything about future of work to questions of racial justice and social disparities, right?
Yep.
So our partnerships with our Spelman and Morehouse and others, and also understand that the future work can also involve our partnership with community colleges. So think about the regional network we have, and think about what it means to kind of raise from an economic development perspective, and that's going to be a major focus for the Biden administration, OSTP, and NSF.
Yeah, which is very exciting. So just so that we know what we're talking about as far as funding opportunities, there's 3 different kinds. There's a planning grant, and interestingly enough, there haven't been too many of these out there. And so the planning grant is a 1-year planning grant. It's $150,000, and it really is to get you, it's like a seed grant to get your ducks in a row to start planning to actually submit the research grant. And I mean, the research grants are, pretty nice. They're anywhere from, $500K all the way up to $2 million. And then there's like the transition to scale. And those are obviously, the golden eggs. So $1.5 million to $5 million over a 5-year period. So these are, again, just to get you thinking about what is it that you want to do. If you're early on, and if you have an idea, right, might be that the planning grant is just right. Now, it turns out that, I should have signed up earlier, but, we can always think about this next year. So that's coming up. So think about these 3 levels of funding as we go through. And so what exactly do they want? Well, they want research that is multidisciplinary, right? And that addresses that intersection of technology, human, and then the point that Beth just made about that societal dimension. So anywhere that we could think about, are we leaving people behind? How do we get them to jump on the tech for good bandwagon? And so that's, one area. There's, of course, and here, depending on the agency, there's these issues with technological innovation, right? And so again, it's not technology innovation for kind of future computing, but really is so that it's integrated with advances in, across the board, from behavioral science to engineering to learning sciences and technology. And then again, trying to think about the adult learning community. So some of the points that that Beth made. And some time ago we had, so there's two things here. I was thinking about with, learning science and adult learning and workforce training. We lost a lot of capabilities when Barb left. Barb Erickson left, right? She did a lot of work in how do you train teachers to teach CS. And so again, what is it that we have a lot of strengths in, and how is it that we could bring it to that? The other day I was in a meeting with College of Computing Graduate Council, and this question came up of, we get all of these applicants that want to get a CSMS, but they come here and they're they're physicists, or they're aeronautics people, so they feel like, hey, I'm smart, I can do this, and then they get here and they're like, yikes, algorithms. And so how do we start thinking about, we brought, as I was thinking about it, we brought the OMSCS to the country. Why not bring the BSCS, right? We also had a dean candidate that had suggested that. But even, what about the post-bac, the CS or the engineering post-baccalaureate degree to Georgia Tech, right? How do we leverage the kind of infrastructure we have for learning and again, to bridge the gap? So I think that's, as I was thinking about it, and I always tell my grad students, at some point there are all sorts of interesting things and you're not going to be interested. And so I think these issues of adult training and education are really, really interesting. I don't have the bandwidth, but I think that Georgia Tech, given that one of the things you need to show is that you have, the set of infrastructures, I think that this is one of the things that Georgia Tech could really exceedingly do well with. And maybe you remember this, Beth. Do you remember that we got one big training grant that was looking at, I think it was like fire and community colleges? It was with Bronstein. It was about 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah, no, that would be because we worked with Gwinnett Tech and others, right, on understanding. Yeah, so what NSF wants to avoid is technology just automates everybody out of jobs. Societally, that's not what they're interested in, and it certainly doesn't play well with Congress. So what they're interested in is, however, that some of these, for example, healthcare jobs, also kind of public works, things that were primarily manual are now going to involve technologies, right? Whether it's different forms of digital health records, or whether it is sensors on bridges for smart cities, right? In all these cases, the community college oriented jobs are changing, and so they're looking for these partnerships. And I think fire was one variation of that.
Right, but again, I think that there are these areas where we've already shown that we have expertise, and we already shown that that we can do the work. And so to get people that are at those intersections seem like prime candidates. And then the kind of the big one is proposals that address the impact of large-scale disruptions. I'm sure everybody got the call that just came out from the CDC and COVID. There was like COVID-19 funds for personal protective gear. And then there was also another call that was looking at decreasing youth violence, right? So again, these things that are at those intersections seem really interesting.
Just a quick note on that, because Becky had put something in the chat. There's going to be tremendous investment in learning from the COVID pandemic and pandemic proofing the U.S. for the next go around. So for a bunch of folks that have been involved in just how do we address COVID, you can turn a reflective lens on that and say, okay, here's what didn't work. What is the future of work for the next pandemic? So Brad, like the things that you guys are doing in RADX, there's been so many great ways where Georgia Tech has said, all right, how do we respond to the immediate needs of this crisis? And then that gives us all of this data and experience to turn from a reflective point of view to say what needs to be, how do we need to be ready for the next one? Because there's at least full agreement from the funding agencies that there is a next one. So there's going to be more and more funding in that space.
Right. And so even, the fact that we've done such an outstanding job with our testing, right? How do we turn that around into a kind of recipe for how other states, or other universities can do it? And so I think that is also, it also seems like it's really ripe for, again, what has Georgia Tech done really well, and then how can we leverage that? And so how is work defined? Well, work is defined as mental or physical activity to achieve tangible benefits such as income, profit, or community welfare. So once again, very much a kind of not-for-profit, profit, and community engagement. And, the key thing is that it must focus on advancing fundamental understanding of future work and outcomes for workers. So this is where, basically, how can you scale X, where X is some workforce? So what is a workforce that you hope to impact? So at the same, kind of the specific objectives. So just to restate it, it's facilitate multidisciplinary and convergent research, right? It's support a deeper understanding of the societal infrastructure that accompanies this. So this is very kind of HCC, right? How do you understand the socio-technical context of what you're doing? And so there's, there's social behavioral funding, not just the computational part. So again, this opportunity for these multidisciplinary proposals. Harkening on this idea of development at the research community, right? Dedicated to designing intelligent technologies and work organization and modes inspired by positive impact of individual workers. So I think a lot of the work that, or maybe to think about some of the projects that, IPAT and other places on campus are doing for, smart and connected cities, right? How do we turn those how do we turn that around to one of these massive scale level proposals? So again, and creative and inclusive workplaces, right? So also about infrastructure. This reminded me a lot of the work that the people in architecture did. Remember, I'm going to forget. Memory is really bad at 3 o'clock. Anyway, the work on spaces, well, hospital spaces. How do we think about, noise and acoustics for kind of the patient rooms of the future? I think that could be fantastic. And again, something that Georgia Tech has so much expertise in. So the kind of the virtual spaces on the one hand, right? All the things that we've learned via COVID, but, there are places that are still working, right? I was just, these hospital spaces, how do we, get them ready? And then again, promote deeper basic understanding of the interdependent human technology partnership. So again, these socio-technical questions about how do you keep these systems working? So you have words like harmony with the human worker, right? So where do you have these opportunities for human, robot, human, AI, all of these capabilities? And then I was at I think it was like at a DARPA challenge, and I had forgotten just how important all the all of the cognitive implications are of decision making. I was really surprised at some of the grants that were out there, really to just understand decision making at a very basic level. And again, as we start thinking about some of the work that Mark Rydell is leading on understandable AI, at some point having those interfaces for the humans and for these embodied agents and the other side of it. So I think that's another interesting opportunity. And then I want
to call out, because I'm looking at who's in the audience, the virtual audience. So I see Karen and others. This is a great area where NSF wants to connect with assistive technologies. So as we look at an aging workforce, and we look at, especially if you have new models of working from home, right? All of the again, things that we've discovered during the pandemic. Um, how do we? I think we really can connect a lot of the work that's being done in the RERCs to this call as well. And I don't know if those teams have tried to do that in the past.
Yeah.
And anything that is AI teaming, AI not for automation, but AI for amplification, AI for partnership, AI to stitch together collaborations. There's lots of money that has to be earmarked to have the word AI in it. But again, NSF is wanting to stay away from anything that is automation job killing. So AI teaming is, it's a double word score type of opportunity.
And Beth, one of the things that we've been talking about is this idea of turning the idea of assistive technology on its head, right? Because in most contexts, we've been talking about assistive technology and in addressing some level of functional limitation, right, to allow you to operate at a different capacity. But when you're talking about assistive technology for the workforce, it could be assistive technology for the general population to allow you to gain an expertise that you are a skill or an ability that you might not otherwise have, right?
Okay.
Even though, that's not due to a disability. So the thought being, if a police officer pulls over someone who is hard of hearing or deaf, they might not know sign language, but an assistive technology could assist them in communicating with that individual.
Yeah, no, that would be terrific. And I think anything that, if you can somehow do that, but do it in a mental health context.
Exactly. That was the other challenge, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also even some of there's some things that, and I think sometimes to think about the pet projects that some of these faculty have. So Thad has been working on, improving bin sorting, right? The kind of things where, if VR has now made it to prime time, right? Where is it that you can have these intersections of augmented reality or virtual reality within the workspace? I have
simulation training, VR, all fair game for this, right? And that allows you to construct an NSF grant, which is kind of the outreach side. So, connecting with quote, real people who are either being educated to or working in this space, but also allowing you to have a big kind of tech simulation, technical expertise in that as well.
I just want to comment on the work that I'm doing right now. So I'm working on a virtual reality program for people with autism to help them train their social skills at workplaces. So for example, they have challenges in social skills and how we can simulate those job environment social skills in VR and how we can automate like their behavior interactions with other people and then give appropriate feedback for them. So would this be also like interesting idea for this kind of
Perfect. Right.
I think that, the way that I've read this is you'd have to think about how would you train it, how would you train the trainer, right? Mm-hmm. So where it wouldn't be about, maybe it wouldn't be about the individual with autism, but how would you train, and I'll tell you one of the projects I'm working on, how would you train the speech therapist, right? Mm-hmm. To do this at scale. Mm-hmm. I know that in autism, one of the big problems is how do we, get assessment or get interventions? And so I think mm-hmm. this would be much more of like, how do you bring, speech pathologists to rural areas, or how do you train them, or mm-hmm. or even, what is the OT, right? Occupational mm-hmm. therapist, right? So I think it would be at the level of the workforce.
I see.
Right? So that's the point. The point is that you're looking at the workforce and the workers, right? So the workers. So I think we have to be at that level. And that's, one of the things I've tried to do is, one thing you can do, and I sent these to you, Jennifer. So when I was going through it, there were quite a number of, I think there was like 3 different grants that looked at virtual reality and occupational training, right? So that's for the occupational trainer. And so, I think that I put that information in the chat, and you can just check and see. I think there's nothing wrong with reverse engineering, right? What are people doing? So
Yeah.
And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
Jennifer, I'd also, go ahead and get Prabha's email. So he's the first one listed as a program officer. And just shoot him, a 1-page, abstract or something that say, I'm learning more about this call. Here's what I'm doing. Which parts of this do you think would be applicable? And, there's enough time to get that feedback. And I think it would be interesting to see if it's who I'm thinking of. He's fairly new from an NSF point of view. So it's always trying to figure out where the call is going in terms of where he wants to lead it.
I see. Okay. Thanks for the suggestions.
And so, so again, just to kind of situate this, there's the planning grant, there's the actual research grant, and then there's a transition to scale, which, are really big, and they're for a longer period of time. And so, I don't know, I think if I think about the planning grant, I'll tell you about a planning grant that we're working on. One of the planning grant that we're working on, so I was going to say, what has been funded in Georgia, right? And so you see that the big one, kudos to our friends at University of Georgia, because, what is it? Was that the one? We've got, 2 million, covered my own thing. But you see, you have the kind of cyber-physical human collaborative cognition, right? So that's the kind of that intersection, right? That's on the smaller side. It's a planning grant. So this is a grant where, he got the first one, and he got a little bit of, think about it as seed money, and then, to do the study. Then there's the University of Georgia grant, right? This is $2 million. Basically cultivating capacity. So again, what they do well is the kind of digital agriculture, right? We have the collaborative research, future expert work, and the age of the black box. So this is one of the few healthcare grants, right? And this is one that our dear Mark Rydell is a co-PI on, or a PI on. And then we have a kind of human-robot interaction grant that was also, I'm sorry, I have to keep moving the little box. I don't know exactly where to put it so I can read that. Anyway, but the nice thing, Patricio, and so the nice thing is in the chat, you'll see I have the link to all of the various, you can search by state, you can search by, the body that gives out the funds, so SICE or CBE or whatever. And so one of the neat things that I found was that there's actually not that many health grants, and even less mental health grants. And this is, I think that it depends how you think about health. And so I told you I found 3 that had to do with VR, just as I was looking for health. But there are few health grants, and so it seems like, that area is interesting. When I first thought about this, as you guys know, I got a grant that looks at PTSD, and so I thought, well, maybe the question is, how do we train the workforce of clinicians? And so, that was kind of my, one idea was, how do we educate more therapists in evidence-based treatment for PTSD? Right, where, this might be a way of thinking about it. We ended up, we're going to be working on a variation of this, where for those of you that, I'll start at the beginning. In mental health, the fidelity or evidence-based treatments are really important. And so what that usually means is that these clinicians have to come to get trained. So in autism, you have, the gold standard of autism diagnosis. And so you have to come to, Georgia and get trained, and then the people will practice with two or three clients, and then those videos get sent back to the trainers, and they get consultation. And this idea is pretty much, this idea of fidelity-based training is pretty much standard fare for mental health therapy. And so we're going to be looking at doing this for the gold standard, which is prolonged exposure therapy. And so this is a colleague of mine who's an assistant professor at Emory. And so I think, the idea is that this smaller kind of grant is a nice way to, start thinking about the future. And so, the way that we think about it, when we, hopefully we'll get this grant, we'll do some of the basic research to set up the infrastructure to apply for a bigger grant. And then for the bigger grant, we'll implement some of the tools that we're using for our current NSF grant. And so that's, kind of one idea. So I thought that, I don't know, we could either brainstorm by talking about, just even from this conversation, what kind of things have you thought about? We could also just take, I'm going to, I can escape from here. I'm going to try to go on the, I also had a Word doc. Oh, right. So speaking of healthcare grants, there were these ideas of learning systems that enable healthcare workers to perfect safety critical hospital work, right? So again, it was physiological sensing to enable expert decision making, but that was basically it. There was only about 3 different ones that were specifically about health. The last one was telemedicine at scale, expanding the healthcare workforce and healthcare access. So, and that was the University of Maryland. So these 2 were augmented reality, first-person view and augmented reality for airborne embodied intelligent cognitive assistance, right? So we talked a little bit about that. And by the way, if you go online, you can press on it and it'll send us to wherever. So you can get an idea of, what the aims are of these studies. So augmenting spatial cognition capability of future workers to enhance performance in altered environments using virtual reality. So that was another one. And again, there were some that reminded me of people here. So there was one about social media, right? And there was one about algorithms. Somebody's at the door because there's always somebody at the door, right? Excuse me. So again, we can definitely take it for a ride. We can start having a discussion. I don't know if anybody has any ideas or any thoughts.
Thank you, Rosa. This is great. So my dogs are going crazy over here. So sorry, I keep coming in and out. So part of it is just a little bit of the inside baseball. So if you look at the program officers associated with this, so you see Dan Cosley. So Dan Cosley is a longtime CHI, HCI person, very friendly and supportive of our community. So that's another person if you're thinking of like, does this even fit or getting feedback? I think my understanding is Dan is like really responsive and really supportive. So that's a good person to reach out to. And then I've lost the name. David Corman. He is, he, I think still leads, or he's definitely involved in the smart, connected communities. So he's very much an IoT, cyber, physical, kind of the future of work where it involves sensing the physical world. So he would provide feedback, but that also gives you an understanding of some of the topics that Rose has mentioned, that it has that, digitization or augmentation of the world through Internet of Things, through ubiquitous computing. And so he would be something who would provide feedback, and that gives you a sense as to that those priorities within this call. But Alex, one of the things I heard recently in the call was everything is about trusting visualization. So not can we visualize it, but do we trust it? And would people trust it? And will people act on it? And so I think everything kind of in your shop around bias and trust, and the visual analytics side would be very welcome in this space.
Yeah, Dan's actually the PM on my grant about trust and bias and viz and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, Rosa, thanks for bringing this up and giving the overview. Actually, there's two we mentioned, like pet projects that we do that might be relevant. There's two, I guess, in my wheelhouse. One is this sort of bias and things like that, and I think specifically it's I've got one student working on sort of what's the side effect as we start automating parts of data-driven decision making, right? I mean, it's all the rage. It's like, oh, we'll just automate this and we'll present you an insight, right? You don't have to click around. We'll just give you the insight. And we're actually sort of going through methodical tests of saying, okay, well, are we losing out, right? Is it better to force people to interact as opposed to automate the interaction? For decision making of data and things like that. So I think that was, I forget, objective 4 maybe, where that one seemed to resonate a little bit.
And I'll send my slide deck. It might save you some time of having to copy and paste or whatever, but I'll definitely send the slide deck. And then the question would be, I guess, can you think of a workforce that is actually doing this now, right? Because I think that would be the kind of the catch. Right? So sure, you can show this in a lab, and I don't know, anybody else that's on the call, can you think of an application of a workforce that actually has to do this? So for example, I'm making this up, but what about people that get 911 calls, right? What about people that, are getting this information, or even, what is it, in Atlanta, we have that 311, do you know about this, Beth? Like the 311 center where people get whatever information they need. And basically the operator has to be able to triage what the person needs. And so, again, I think that if we think about, smart and connected cities, where is it that we could actually get data that requires, that's supposed to be automated so that then you can actually show this, that this could be something. So
Way back when I had less gray hair, back in the 90s, we actually did the research at Georgia Tech for the traffic management centers for the Federal Highway Association, and wrote the handbook on how to develop those centers. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. Well, what's the next step, right? So
yeah.
I think there's also nothing wrong with, taking these old grants and making them 2.0, because, it might be worth, I think what they really want is to be able to. And I talked to, it wasn't one of the two that you mentioned, but I talked to one of the PMs about this, and, the main thing is, there has to be a workforce. Like, what's the workforce? Like, I have this idea. What's the workforce? And so I think that comes back to, can we think about ways that people are doing this? And then how can we leverage, the connections, that GTRI has. I mean, they've got so many connections to do that.
So Rosa, if you want to, I think you're still sharing.
Yeah.
If you quit sharing your screen, we can see more faces, because there's a lot of good folks here in the mix.
Okay.
And I think one of the things, as Rosa was saying about, GTRI, I think our applied research centers, seismic, Georgia Tech probably has way more connections to potential workforces, either in the education or the actual conducting that work. So this is where IPAC can try to come in and help, which is to facilitate those partnerships and track down letters and all that kind of good stuff, but to get those conversations going. So just because you don't have a workforce connection, don't give up. Toss that as a potential need into the mix.
And so I just
So,
wanted to bring a couple of these items in because, I never take these things for a ride, but it's really nice. You can look, you can search by the organization, right? You can search by, the funding or the area. So I think that it makes it easy to do this well. I wanted one of my, colleagues that does this, you know, category thing to kind of find the space that really, that we can get it funded. Like, how can we work this? I'm going to stop sharing. But anyways, I highly recommend people to take this for a ride. You could even download the whole Excel. It's crazy. But
Can you copy and paste the link to the chat,
they're
please?
all there.
Oh,
All the
okay.
links are in the chat. So I have the call, the search option, and the PDF.
so one of the things that I've struggled with, my PhD student Alyssa has been looking at exactly this kind of work in the manufacturing space. Right, what's the future of manufacturing? Um, Applying different kind of VR models, applying different augmented or wearable models. And the workforce the workplace has changed from COVID in interesting ways, in that at least in manufacturing, and she's really looking at small to medium-sized manufacturing shops across Georgia, where the kinds of capacity pressures that they were having a year ago in terms of making automation and making these technologies compelling are gone. And so there's no more interest in the workforce to say like, oh, well, we don't need automation anymore because actually we don't have enough work to keep our people on the floor long enough. And so the last thing we want to do is, have people have to go home more. So I think this is a challenge that we're having just from a field site management perspective of like, how do like manufacturing still is very much a manual process. But the pieces around automation that were kind of compelling sites of inquiry a year ago are not, and it's also not clear how quickly that's going to rebound. So if anyone has any good ideas, I mean, maybe the ideas don't do manufacturing, but I think that ship has sailed.
So I'm not sure if this is a solution to the kind of problem you've got, Chris, but I'll throw it out anyways because it's something that's cropped up, and I think it's got some elements of a number of these things. So Georgia Tech has a problem, right? One of the problems that has emerged out of COVID is that in our mandate to train the next generation of researchers, it's gotten a lot harder. And one of the areas where it's gotten particularly hard is how do you onboard new undergraduates and graduate students to an extent when the onboarding itself requires using specialized machines, because that puts people within the 6-foot distance of each other in a closed space, sometimes a sort of a comprehensively ventilated space, and it has to be ventilated in a certain ways kind of space, to do side-by-side training. And I was thinking in terms of it, you were talking about manufacturing, and I was thinking about like whether training in that context over particular technologies. But there's been a lot of interest in like how you might do it with an experienced person, say wearing a camera or something, demonstrating how the machine works, and then sharing it and getting somebody who's never used the machine to see to do the same activity, to see if they can learn via technology. And I'm sort of curious about it because I think Georgia Tech itself, the campus, could be a test bed. And so that puts, before you try to go out to a real manufacturing site, we have a lot of colleagues that work in fields like chemical engineering, where machine use is absolutely crucial to the success of their research. And they're really struggling with how to reintegrate undergraduates to their labs, and our undergraduates are losing a significant number of research opportunities because for a long time we just thought it's just not safe to let the undergrads return to the lab.
Yeah, I think that also those same sets of constraints certainly also apply in the trade school setting too, where you need to be training particular kinds of equipment use or particular kinds of techniques.
Yeah, I guess I also thought, Chris, about something that, I think a lot about with clinical psychologists, but it's this transition from novice to expert. And so I think that even in manufacturing, even if there's a little bit of it, how do you train, I think she just gave us an example and, to use a particular tool, but, that's another question. How do we move from novice to expert or from novice to competence? And how are we able to see, how are we able to do this in a kind of a systematic, manner?
I just like to say I don't think manufacturing will disappear. If anything, it'll probably grow because there's just this whole episode with COVID. I think there's bipartisan support for the idea that we're not going to rely on cheap Asian labor for everything anymore. Manufacturing of masks comes to mind. We were short on the ability to make isopropyl alcohol for a long time. It's kind of crazy things. So I think could make the case that you need to use technology to get to improve our efficiency to where we're cost competitive.
One of the topics that we addressed some number of years ago was actually in the automobile manufacturing industry, where they were having trouble retaining skilled workers as people aged, right? The pressure of the manufacturing line was such that they wanted out of that kind of work, that kind of workflow. And so they were actually engaging Georgia Tech to try to figure out how to reduce the cognitive demands of manufacturing on older workers so they could retain those workforces.
That same thing happened in oil and refinery and chemicals. They lost a lot of those older experts.
Yeah, if we want to.
This is Karen.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, well, go ahead. I was going to switch topics slightly.
Oh, okay, real quick. So I do have another bit of research in the automotive space that I do with Ford, where they're getting increasing pressure and worried about the safety regulations that will be driven down based on automotive vehicles and self-driving capabilities. So what they're looking for is technology to help bridge safety features, sensors, sensor systems on cars, all the way from the design of a car to the UX to tell somebody about and all this, right? And I'm only doing sort of a bit of a very small piece of that, which is like, oh, build visualizations to help the functional safety engineers and the designers and blend these things together and show them connections and all this kind of stuff. But I think at a larger level, somebody like Ford is increasingly concerned about how manufacturing of vehicles will be safe and efficient and abide to standards going forward. So I don't know if that's a space.
And that reminded me about this kind of adversarial computing, which is almost the other side of Norman, right? It's like, how do you find all the errors? In some sense, you think that you're building something safe, but how could you, what is this adversarial computing? How do you find all those faults in these vision systems that supposedly do so well, and then you put a little black bar and all of a sudden, right, it's saying that it's a gun instead of a tortoise or whatever. So I think that adversarial computing is also very interesting.
Okay.
Karen?
This is Karen.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go after Karen.
Okay. Hi. So thank you for the shout out earlier. I would like to mention that our center does include quite a variety of people dealing with people with disabilities in various contexts. Some are researchers, some are not. So if you actually wanted to find an SLP or an OT, we have some of those on staff as well. So, and they are interested in getting involved in more research, though you probably wouldn't have them leading the project, but they can definitely provide different support roles. I had a question, though, and it has to do with how geeky do these projects have to be? And I'm asking because I have a project right now where we're looking at how to characterize and possibly measure mastery of assistive technology, which could possibly be expanded to what
one of you alluded to earlier, which was how do you define, novice versus proficient user and making the jump between that. But that would not necessarily be, a project mediated by virtual reality or augmented reality or, artificial intelligence. Is that something that they would actually care about, or does that not? I mean, does that fit into this or not?
I would think so, and I think that, I mean, they talked about these multidisciplinary teams, and so I think that then the argument would be that you have the conceptual know-how, and that now you would, partner with a technologist that would be able to think about, how to automate it. So, for example, in our planning grant, right, we have the clinician who knows about, the art of therapy, right? And then what we're doing is we're using a particular fidelity scale. And then, I'm doing the HCI part, so I'm having a focus group to understand basically what all of the clinicians understand. And then we have a UBAComp guy that's going to be thinking about, now that we have the videos, how does the machine figure out aspects of validity, for example, in the affective content of the interaction. So I think that it's great because it's actually real people.
Well, what I was wondering though is, do we have to automate it for them to be interested in it, or can we come up with a rubric by the end of all of this, and that would work?
I think it has to scale, right?
It's worth exploring. So this is a cross directorate program. So it's not just the computing and engineering folks, but also the social, behavioral, and engineering, or not engineering, economic folks, as well as the EHR. So I think the main thing is that they want the quote unquote basic science side. So it's geeky in that way, but it doesn't have to be. So it is the human technology frontier. So there needs to be technology in the frontier part, but it doesn't have to be a fully technical approach.
Got it.
Yeah, and
okay.
I
That's what I
reviewed,
was checking on, because this is a project that we're working on with Bruce Walker, actually. So it's more of a psychology-ish type thing as applied to technology, not using technology to deliver it. So
yeah, and so I guess I reviewed about probably 50 of those calls, and I was looking at the SBE. So I would say just go to the SBE and see what it is. And of the 50 that I saw, 50 of them had technology in it. So I think that there has to be the scale part, the workforce of the future part. But maybe you'll find the ones that don't.
Okay, I was going to jump after Karen, mainly because I was thinking in a very different way when I saw this call. I'm an economist, associate professor at the School of Economics at Georgia Tech, and my work is more focused on poverty and inequality in the United States. I work on creating different indices of deprivation. And especially during the COVID, the pandemic, our work has been focused more on how things have altered for workers, right? How the unemployment levels are affecting even basic necessities like food and security among households. So I was thinking more in terms of future of work in the sense of are we thinking of workers' productivity, right? Enhancing that productivity. Are we thinking of the wages that the Biden administration is proposing, a minimum wage of, say, $15? Are we thinking of improving the living quality or the standards of living for these workers? And what would be some of the ways in which technology or improvement in the work conditions can enhance workers, not just income, but just the quality of life for these workers. And that may be something of interest where the SBE part is coming in terms of technology. So just throwing out that idea that there would be also a different aspect to this project.
So no, I think this is terrific. So if you look at the fifth part, understand, anticipate, and explore ways of mitigating potential risk, including inequity arising from the future of the human technology frontier. I think I think that would be the SBE angle in this. I also think there's probably a gazillion people, well, at least 20 people on this call that could be interested in partnering with you to say, okay, here's the technical side of what we're doing, but we really need to understand kind of the future economic angles in this. And those types of partnerships would be incredibly powerful.
All right. But, so I'm there. Thanks,
Yeah,
Beth.
can you put a web page or a name or contact information in the chat just for those who don't recognize you already?
Okay.
That's fantastic.
What else? What's another idea that was you just thought, wow, that might be interesting? We're at the end, so somebody gets the last word.
Last pitch.
All right, I'll go. So I've got two hats that I wear. One is a psychology and one is a policy hat. So from a policy perspective, I mean, it's pretty clear whatever we do has to have a policy side of it. This is one of those areas that's one of those murky areas that can't just have a technological solution. It has to have a societal solution. From a psychologist perspective, though, I'm interested in how we preserve meaning in work, right? There's so much that's happened over this past year that has pulled us apart, and technology can do that, right? It can be a substitute for human interaction, substitute for that meaning that we find, but there are technologies that can bring us together, right? And figure out what those technologies are to facilitate meaningful work, I think would be an amazing project.
So I think that would be, it would be
I'll
really
say
interesting.
here on that.
Yeah. I think it'd be really interesting is, we think there's all this great advantage of, oh, we've proven you can all work from home forever. The ability to, telecommute and all of this. But, what do we lose in terms of, meeting, interactions? Also, do we become, is it a de-skilling over time because you're not picking up those incidental skills that you happen to because of an office or a physical environment that allows for that? It's kind of the equivalent of like you work on your part of the assembly line as opposed to understanding kind of the manufacturing process as a whole. So points we're going full circle back to manufacturing. So I think NSF would be really nicely timed to say, we've seen these advances or what we are capable of, but however, what are the downsides and what would we do to then not go backwards in time, but how do we chart a path forward around that? So I think that would be beautiful psychology policy. Just pick a technical, something that involves the use of technology or the interaction with technology as part of the work. But once you've put kind of the tele side into it, you're already halfway there.
Yep. I think
I feel like everybody
we're at
should
time.
put their contact information in the chat so you guys can all find each other.
Back to the other side of work, one of the nice things that Omer said recently, and I'm quoting him all the time, is he said, I used to live at home and now I just work here, right? Because you're having meetings all the time and you're always working. What I'm interested in is how can you facilitate, and there's something with VR, how can you facilitate kind of immersive relaxation? And so we were looking at it with meditation, but I had nurses that were saying, I have a 20-minute break. Like, how can I actually just really have a break if I'm in the hospital? And so that's also really interesting.
Gonna have to go into the office to, get away from work at home a little bit.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I'm looking forward to that.
So please reach out to me, to Rosa, to iPad@goodtech.edu. If you feel like you've got like half a team, a third of a team, you need an industry partner, you need a workplace partner, there's great folks here. We've got Russ talking about workforce development with respect to smart cities. As I said, everything we've done to just get by in the past year, put a reflective angle on it and say, okay, what does this mean for our workforce, for work going forward? I apparently need the filter that takes out the dog whining sounds while I'm trying to talk. So need David Anderson to build that for me.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. We didn't know how many people we'd get, but reach out. Thank you.
This is
Bye.
terrific. Thank you, Rosa.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Beth.